Ashley Gordon.
And I'm Kurt Kernut.
And this is Reading for the Rest of Us. It's a book talk show for all readers, whether you read one book a year or 100.
And I'm very excited because this is our second show, but it's my favorite genre. And today we're going to talk about mysteries and crime fiction.
And if you can't find something in detective fiction then you like, I don't think you're trying hard enough.
That's
It
right.
is
There is
vast.
endless proliferation of these types of books, and that's part of the fun of the genre. You know, it's interesting that we're in a recession right now, and yet mystery books thrive. In the last couple years alone, we've seen imprints continue to open even when the publishing industry itself is contracting. And right now, mystery books constitute about 30% of the market, with annual sales almost at $700 million a year. Really, the only genre that sells more is romance fiction. And so there's an interesting sort of appetite, I think, for these books. You and I have talked a lot a bit in preparation for the show about what we like, and I think we have some nice sort of contrasting interests.
Not the same things.
But I wanted to just start out and say, what's the appeal?
I think part of it is what we mentioned before, that there really is something for everybody, whether it's sort of safe mysteries where you really know where you're going to be and you know it won't get too far afield from certain storylines and you know how it will end, to particularly now in modern detective fiction, it can be as sensationalist and dramatic as you want, and everything in between, whether it's set locally or further afield. There literally is the kind of book for every kind of reader at every age group, beginning from kids with like how I got started with Nancy Drew, or my son in his Hardy Boys books. It really runs the gamut.
And even though there is this diversity, there are always sort of basic elements that we are drawn to, and I think we find very satisfying in detective novels. We were having a conversation one time about the word formula.
Yes.
If you listen to sort of a lot of the snob critics, very famous review of I think it's Agatha Christie's Who Killed Roger Ackroyd?
Yeah,
Is that one
Who
of
Killed
his?
Roger Ackroyd.
Edmund Wilson, very famous
The Death
critic.
of Roger Ackroyd.
Death of,
Sorry.
and
That would be Who Killed Roger Rabbit.
Well, Death of
little
Roger
difference.
Ackroyd. And Edmund Wilson once titled a review of Agatha Christie, Who Cares Who Killed Roger Ackroyd?
Oh.
And it was kind of a brutal
That's harsh.
takedown. Yeah, it's kind of a brutal takedown of the whole whodunit sort of appeal. You and I were talking about how the word formula kind of gets a bad rap. And we were sort of saying that formula can actually be kind of very satisfying.
Oh, it's totally satisfying. But before we get to the satisfying part, I want to defend a formula.
Yes.
And it's not, this is not original with me. If you're interested in detective fiction, this is a great book. It's P.D. James talking about detective fiction, and it explains both her writing style and how she does what she does, and she does it probably better than most anybody living at the moment in terms of the British detective, but also how the genre evolved and what its basic tenets are. And she brings up the point about formula and that it's a disparaging term for some people. They look down their nose at this, as they do to romance too. So there's maybe something there for us to discuss later. But her analogy and defense of it is that, would you dare tell William Shakespeare that when he wrote a sonnet and used the formula, that it was somehow less of a poem? So in some ways, writing to a formula is much more difficult than if the entire world is available to you and you can pull in anything.
Right.
But to talk about the satisfaction of that formula, one of the ways that we're different, I think, is that I read detective fiction, and a lot of it, because I love how at the end everything is restored. I know that at the beginning something horrible will happen, and we go through that tension, and it's the increase of tension, and then when it's all solved, you have that catharsis of and particularly with the writers that I pick, I know I will get my end. There have been a few books, not quite in this genre, but Donna Tartt, for instance, who just literally leaves you hanging. Well, I'm not hanging, but there was somebody hanging in the book. So literal is true. But you're just left at the end with no answers, and it's very frustrating.
Yeah.
So in a world that is somewhat out of control, I think I had 6 weeks of thinking I was in control right before my kids were born, and then that was over forever. So in a world where you really don't control anything much, it's a safe place to go.
Yeah. That's an excellent sort of analysis of the appeal of it. It's weird because I come into it, I guess, a little bit differently, and I'm not sure why, but I find myself, when I read detective fiction, almost competing with the plot. It's like...
It's a male thing.
Well, yeah, could very well be. Try to outsmart me. And I think the weird thing is you at some point in your life, you've read so many of these, and you've seen so many TV shows, that I start to try to predict as we're moving along.
Yeah, and some are painfully predictable.
Right, what the twists are going to be. And I find the ones that are most pleasing are the ones where I didn't see the twist coming, and they sort of hit you upside the head.
As long as they don't do too many gymnastics to try to make it happen.
Yeah, there are those twists where it's kind of the old kind of, and then I woke up sort of ending.
Yeah.
That are
Bobby's really not dead.
Right. Yes.
Sorta.
He was just taking a shower for a year.
Yeah. Well, okay. Then I have a question.
Okay.
Because one of my beefs is the serial killer.
Okay.
That drives me up the wall. I tend to read detective fiction where the age-old motives of greed, lust, jealousy, those are the things that motivate the killer, and it's usually somebody that you've known all through the book and you just didn't see it.
Yeah.
And a lot of modern detective fiction, I have found, introduces this serial killer element, and they're just crazy.
Yeah.
They're not motivated by anything that I can relate to,
Right.
although I got some crazies in the family, but not that kind. So if you like it to be a surprising ending, but not one that is an unrealistic ending, how do you feel about the serial killer?
Personally, I get a little tired of them because they've just been going on for so long. They really aren't, it's really a relatively recent phenomenon. It's usually attributed to Jim Thompson's The Killer Inside Me.
Okay.
And I think it's a fascination with the psychopathology of abnormality.
Yeah.
Or it's almost a scientific sort of effort to figure out where did somebody become antisocial. And I think that's part of it. But I also think the more graphic and the more violent that novels became or fiction became, there was really nowhere else to take it except to these sort of very, very bizarre extremes, to where once in the 70s you had this phenomenon of serial killers in real life that people began talking about, that a lot of writers began fixating on just very macabre ways of dispatching the victims. And in some cases, I think it's sort of sheltered by the forensic approach, where you have these detectives who are on the side of science who come at it autopsying everything.
CSI.
And, yeah, so that you can get the gore that way, and it becomes a buffer.
It legitimizes the gore by including the forensics of
Right,
it?
right, I think so. The Hannibal Lecter thing, where you've got people eating people's brains out of their heads and that kind of stuff. To me, the violence almost gets a little cartoony in some serial killer novels. And I think it really reflects our sort of anxiety about what happens if there aren't some sort of natural human limits to our behavior. But at the same time, it gets a little jokey after a while. I mean, let's face it, there's only so many ways you can carve up a body and do things with the limbs.
Right.
And I think it becomes a kind of competition.
I say right, like I would know.
Well,
okay, so that makes me wonder if we aren't seeing a shift, because some of the books that I've recently read and enjoyed, Jacqueline Winspear, her female detective, her stories are set between the wars in Britain, between World War I and World War II. There's another one set in Britain. This Alan Bradley and Flavia de Luce, who's a 11-year-old-ish British girl in the 50s who's into science, and so she typically solves the mysteries, and she's delightful. So I wonder if that need for modern writers to get more and more sensational and more violent is avoided in some way by these writers going back in time and setting it before society really sort of spun in that direction.
I think there is an effort in some ways to pull back from that. You know, you always have a tension between the violence and sort of the ingenuity of the sleuth. And I think in a lot of these are set in what was called the Golden Age, the 20s and 30s, and the effort there was really to sort of demonstrate the power of the mind.
The little gray cells.
Exactly.
Little gray cells.
You know, when the detective fiction started in the 1840s with Edgar Allan Poe, that was really his gimmick. He had this thing called ratiocination, which is reason, the application of reason. So you get in the 3 stories that he wrote about the detective Auguste Dupin, you get him really engaging, you know, sort of analyzing clues. And they're games. It's intellectual games, intellectual puzzles. And you're trying to deduce from the signs that you have around you what happened.
You're sounding a whole lot like Sherlock Holmes.
Well, and that's exactly where Sherlock Holmes comes from.
Right.
There's a pre-Sherlock Holmes that you love, that I think has gotten overlooked, and that's Wilkie Collins.
It has gotten overlooked, the Moonstone, because when I went looking for it again, just to see if it was widely out there, it really isn't. Few copies in the library, not many in the bookstores. The Woman in White, which is another book by Wilkie Collins, and is suspenseful and is a mystery in that sense, is pretty popular. But the Moonstone is considered the very first detective novel, and it has many of the tenets that we'll see later. It's an English country house. It's a lauded and highly regarded detective. There's a family with some subplots going on, and there's the crime in the center of it, but all of this other stuff swirling around it. So it really, going back to the formula, between Poe and Collins, on either side of the pond, they seem to set that formula.
One of the interesting things I think about those types of detectives is they're infallible. I mean, it's really interesting that these guys, Dupin in particular, it comes off as like a smarty pants. I mean, there is no getting anything past him, and that becomes sort of one vein that I think detective fiction, you know, peels off into. But then you get to Sherlock Holmes, and I'm just going to be very honest with you. I loved Sherlock Holmes when I was a kid, but I am so Sherlock Holmes'd out.
Reached your threshold.
Exactly. We have, you know, there are the movies, of course, and now a couple television shows. But you are a fan of one of the television shows.
The BBC production that takes Sherlock Holmes and plops it in modern-day London.
Right.
And it's fascinating. And I think that, too, speaks to your very first question, which is why is this so popular? You can put this basic formula, this kind of story, in any period, in any country, in any culture, and it resonates. One of the things we were talking about with Agatha Christie was 4 billion books in print and 103 languages. So it really is cross-cultural, this desire to find the answers. You could probably get really existential with that if you wanted to, going back to that puzzle and piecing it all together and finding out what is the core, what is the truth.
You know, it's really nothing personal, Sherlock, if you're watching, but I think my thing with that is there are so many other great detectives that have sort of been overshadowed in those periods. Nobody really talks much anymore about S.S. Van Dyne's Philo Vance, who was huge in the 20s and 30s, or Nero Wolfe, and there's a lot of fun sort of detective type figures in that period that I think get totally overshadowed by our sort of continued return to Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah, it has been milked. But there is one that we share, despite our disparity in what we read. Sort of the ultimate, the best ever of the hard-boiled detectives.
Yes.
And one of the best writers, really, I think, in American fiction at the time, and that's Dashiell Hammett and Sam Spade.
I got to tell you, I am totally a Dashiell Hammett guy. I mean, I get so into those books. You know, my wife will call and I'll pick up the phone. I'll go, "What's the rumpus?" And she'll be like, "Oh God, you're reading that book again, aren't you?" Hammett, to me, is so interesting because that's really the hard-boiled guys are really that brought a sort of literary jazz, a sass to the genre, and I think they are very 1920s in the way that they're using a lot of slang. Part of the fun of the book is strictly the language. I mean, the plots can often fall apart. It's interesting because my favorite Hammett is not the Maltese Falcon. It's not The Thin Man, which is actually considered the worst of his books.
Made some pretty silly but entertaining movies out of it.
Yeah. And don't read The Thin Man and drive because your blood alcohol is going to be so high just by reading the book.
Should we run a little caution
that's right,
across
a little
the bottom of
disclaimer
the
at the
screen?
bottom. My favorite is The Glass Key, which we just showed the cover of when it appeared in Black Mask magazine. The reason I like that one, it was Hammett's favorite actually of all 4 or 5 of his novels, but he takes the hard-boiled detection story and puts it into politics. And so it's a story about figuring out a murder in the context of the political machines of Baltimore, you know, in the 20s.
And it was pretty violent, if I remember correctly.
All of those.
He didn't shy away from blood.
No, all of those books are violent. But again, there's an element in there of jokiness because there's a sort of sass to the violence too when you're describing the violence. There's not a horror of it.
No, and it didn't feel gratuitous.
Yeah.
I think he does such a good job of creating the atmosphere and that world of the Baltimore political scene that the violence doesn't feel like it's just shoved in there to keep the excitement and the blood pumping, literally. I got to quit using literally today. The violence is a natural part of the environment.
Yeah. One of the best lines ever, Dorothy Parker wrote of Dashiell Hammett. She said that the guy is so hard-boiled they could roll him across the lawn on the White House lawn on Easter Sunday, and it's very true. The difficulty, I think, of the hard-boiled thing is it becomes stylized very quickly. It's very difficult, I think, for contemporary writers to bring, you know, to do it in a way that doesn't sound like a parody or a pastiche of those types of books.
Well, it's sort of the problem of formula.
Right.
And why formula probably gets a bad rap, to use some lingo. If you do formula poorly, it's really awful.
Yeah.
If you do it beautifully, it can reach some great literary heights, but if you do it poorly, it's just it's a drudgery to read.
And a lot of the original pulp fictions that Hammett would have appeared alongside are pretty formulaic in the bad sense. I will say one thing for the detective magazines that came up in the 20s and 30s.
And there were tons of them.
Just
both here
huge
and
amounts.
in the UK, and lots of women writers. One of the collections I found that Ellery Queen edited was all women writers.
Right.
They were very prolific.
I think one of the fun things of rediscovering a lot of that stuff, however bad it is, you go back and you realize how these stories were engaging the history of their time. One of my favorite and probably the most famous issue of Black Mask magazine was dedicated to the Ku Klux Klan. And they were stories both pro and against the Klan. And so the one that came out of it that really established the hard-boiled detective was by a guy named John Carroll Daly, called The Knights of the Open Palm, and it portrayed the Klan as the the thugs that they were. But there are other stories in there that are pro-Klan, and you're just sitting there going, wow, that's sort of an amazing thing to think about. The way
it becomes anthropological as
Yeah,
well as
yeah,
literary.
yeah.
And really some of the best writers, and this is another point that P.D. James makes, but certainly you can find it in any, if you do a wide-reaching reading, the best detective fiction writers will use that formula to their advantage to explore some otherwise sensitive topics, or to bring to light aspects of the society at a time. Because if you use that formula, the word we've used before is it's safe, it's predictable, there's an order to it that's restored at the end, the reader really knows where you're going. So in some ways it maybe allows them to test other boundaries, to push the envelope in other directions. One of the ones that I love that isn't British, believe it or not, Andrea Camilleri, and this is set in Sicily, and so the mob figures prominently in many of the storylines, although not mobsters necessarily. So if you look in many of these, you can find some social commentary that is not so buried, not quite like the bodies, that it really does run all the way through.
It's interesting when you talk about the satisfaction of order restored. I think one of the satisfactions of Hardboiled is that it says there is no order, that it's not restored, and it becomes the pleasure of knowing that everything is corrupt and anarchic.
That anarchy reigns.
Yeah, exactly.
And your hardboiled detective he's almost like the eye of the hurricane. He's there in the middle, and he's constant.
Right.
He is usually alone, and all of these forces are going on around him, and yet he stays the same. So in the midst of this anarchy, there is a constancy.
Right. He's really a night figure, and that's what Raymond Chandler described him as in his essay, The Simple Art of Murder. As fascinated as I am with Hammett and the Hardboiled, you are a big fan of the other famous name from the 20s, which is Agatha Christie.
Agatha Christie.
I read Agatha Christie all the time as a kid, and the only one I've read recently is the Mystery of the Blue Train, which I loved. But you've read quite a bit of them, so what's the appeal?
Probably read most of the 66, if not all. And I did start out with Nancy Drew, what do you think, 8-ish? And then quickly moved on to Agatha Christie, and there were so many. I think that was one of the things that just you never got to the end. There was just, every time you finished one, there was another one.
Right.
And she gave you some variety with Hercule Poirot and the little Belgian detective, and then Miss Marple, who is the epitome of the amateur detective. And although they were formulaic, she wasn't afraid to kill somebody that you really didn't want to see killed. Right. And certainly over such a long career, there are going to be some highs and lows. Some of them are pretty dreadful. But and then there were none, which isn't a detective novel, but is a mystery, murder mystery novel, has got to be one of the most perfectly composed,
greatest twists ever.
Oh, you definitely don't see it coming. And that's one that you can read again, and you're finding something in it again. Right. It's really a masterpiece.
You know, I was struck when I reread The Mystery of the Blue Train, and I think Christie sometimes gets a bad rap, as you know. I think it's a sort of prejudice against Miss Marple herself. But you know, we have this image of little old lady, or even Jessica
Fletcher. Yeah, and that Sherlock
type
Holmes
thing.
fatigue you feel probably is felt by others with how many Miss Marple versions can we see on PBS?
Right.
Thank you very much.
But I was struck by what suspense was in that novel, and really the drama that she has. I mean, there is a stylistic difference to The Hardboiled, but in terms of the suspense and the you know, the evolution of the plot, I was really struck by how contemporary they feel. They don't feel aged to me in the way that, you know, certainly some of the 19th century
well, and you think about how many decades over which she wrote.
That's true. True. We, you know, I'll mention another, some different varieties of the hardboiled that I'm fascinated with. I brought one of my favorite writers right here. These are kind of what we think of when we think of pulp fiction. The John.
I'm looking at this, feeling
John,
the need.
John.
There's
John
not nearly enough
McDonald's.
drama going
Yeah.
on here.
The John D. McDonald's. You know, these are the types of books you'd get in the 40s and 50s. And actually, my dear friend, the late great Wayne Greenhall, gave me a huge box of these.
Quite a wonderful writer himself.
Shortly before he passed away. But those are the types of crime novels
And
and
look,
suspense.
Cape Fear,
Yeah.
which was reset again and
That-
taken in a really negative, not
Yeah.
negative, but really violent, dark
It-
direction.
It's amazing how many of these pulp novels of the 50s and 60s, people keep going back to them and remaking in,
Because the
in
first
different
one,
ways.
the first Cape Fear, there's almost no overt violence,
Yeah,
but the suspense and the just sense of evil is palpable.
yeah, yeah. You know, different movies for different times. It's really kind of shocking. One of the other things we were talking about is the way that these sort of American elements of the detective novel have been internationalized in the last few years. And of course, the biggest mystery novel or suspense novel, detective novel, the past few years has been the Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. And that's sort of created a whole interest in, I think, a different sort of setting for these types of books. You're a big fan of Joe Nesbo.
Yeah,
So,
which I discovered not too long ago. Had tried the Wallander novels and all that snow. Maybe it's being a Southerner, but it was just really bleak.
I
And
do
they
f-
were depressing.
Yeah, I think the setting is what makes a lot of these books.
So
have-
often the
mm,
setting really does have an integral part
Right.
to what the mood of the story
Mhm.
is. I tend to like a little humor with my murder. So the ones that are able to inject humor, I find so satisfying.
Yeah.
And as dark as these are, and they are in that Scandinavian vein of pretty seriously violent, there's a lot of snow, but they weren't quite as bleak and depressing, despite the fact that we have your standard antisocial detective whose relationships never work out.
Yeah.
And one of the ones that I love for that reason is the Donna Leone, who's detective in Venice. Brunetti, he's happily married with children, and they go
How rare
home
is
to
that?
lunch every
Yeah.
day, and we get to find out what he's eating. So there's also a culinary element to it. But like these, Ellie Griffiths, she's got the police detective, and then in this case, a female forensic archaeologist who actually does most of the solving of crimes.
Right.
But her tone, her voice, I tend to listen to these, which is also something we haven't talked about. These
Yeah.
are great audiobooks often, and particularly the Scandinavians where you don't know how to pronounce half the words. The audiobook will help you through it. A friend of mine, Doug, who manages Page and Palette, said that's how he did the Girl with the Dragon Tattoo
okay.
series
Yeah.
on audio, because it helped him with all of those new pronunciations.
Well,
So
you know
but
what?
this one, I'm running, I'm listening to it, and I burst out laughing. I know people
Oh,
think
that's
I'm
great.
nuts, but so that's kind of where we started with there's something for everybody. You can do bleak and depressing and incredibly violent if you want to. You can do sort of kitschy and
Coy,
very
clever,
yeah,
fun.
and very dated.
Yeah.
And then there are plenty of modern ones that that don't leave you
Yeah.
bereft. It's more like real life in
Yep.
that bad things happen and we have to get through it anyway.
Exactly. You know what? We've run out of time, but
Again?
it's amazing how quickly it goes when you start talking about books. But we did want to tell you that at some point down the line, we're going to come back and do a show specifically about Southern mysteries.
Just on Southern.
So we
if
can-
you notice that we didn't mention anybody here that maybe we know, that's
right.
why.
That's right. But I've had a great time, and I want to
As
thank you
always.
again for doing the show, and I want to thank our crew. And we'll see you next time with a show about place in
Sense of
books.
place.
Sense of place.
Yes.
Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.